"Sir, you can't feed someone else's baby like that. What if the mother walks in?" The cashier whispered under her breath, half amused, half uneasy, as the man by the window gently tilted the bottle and said nothing, his eyes calm, his movements steady, like he had done this 1,000 times before. No one in that quiet roadside diner knew that the moment about to unfold would leave the entire room holding its breath. Outside, the late autumn wind swept across the parking lot, rattling loose leaves against rusted pickup trucks and faded sedans, while inside, beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of brewed coffee, Daniel Harper sat in a worn booth with a baby in his arms that wasn't his, or at least, not yet in any way the world would understand. "Easy now, little one. You're okay," he murmured, his voice low and even, the kind of voice that didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't demand attention, just offered quiet reassurance, the kind only someone who had learned to survive storms without raising his voice could carry. 2 years ago, Daniel had buried his wife on a gray morning that never quite left his bones, standing alone in a borrowed suit that didn't fit right, holding the tiny hand of his daughter Lily, who had asked him why mommy wasn't waking up, and since that day, everything in his life had been measured not in comfort, but in endurance. 12-hour shifts at the auto repair shop just off Highway 16. Weekends spent fixing neighbors' broken engines for cash. Nights learning how to braid a little girl's hair by watching shaky videos on his phone. And through it all, he never once allowed himself the luxury of falling apart where anyone could see. "Daddy, is she gonna be okay?" Lily asked now from across the table, her small fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with warm milk, her wide eyes fixed on the baby in Daniel's arms, the stranger they had found less than 15 minutes ago near the back of the diner, left in a carrier beside a booth, like something forgotten, or worse, something abandoned. "She just needs a little help, that's all," Daniel replied, adjusting the thin blanket around the baby's shoulders, his hands careful, practiced, even though no one had ever taught him how to hold another child's future so gently. And for a moment, the noise of the diner softened, conversations lowering, forks pausing midair, because there was something about the way he sat there, a man with grease still under his fingernails and exhaustion in his posture, feeding a crying baby that wasn't his, that made people unsure whether they were witnessing something ordinary or something quietly sacred. "Should we call someone?" Lily whispered, her voice smaller now, as if she already understood that the world didn't always reward kindness with simple answers. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking toward the entrance, toward the glass door that reflected the dimming sky outside, as if he was waiting for something, or someone, to arrive before making that call. "We will," he said finally, not rushing the words. "But let's make sure she's okay first." And then the bell above the diner door rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the low hum of the room like a line drawn across a quiet painting, and a woman stepped inside, her heels clicking once against the tile before she stopped, completely still, her breath catching as her eyes locked onto the booth by the window, onto the man she had never met, holding the baby she had been searching for. And in that single frozen second, something deeper than shock passed through her expression, something that made even the air seem to hesitate. Because what she saw wasn't just a stranger feeding her child, it was a kind of quiet dignity she hadn't expected to find, and the entire room felt it before anyone understood why. "Is that my daughter?" The woman's voice came out barely above a whisper, but it carried through the diner with a sharpness that made every head turn again, and Daniel didn't look startled, didn't flinch. He simply lifted his eyes to meet hers, calm, steady, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. The baby in his arms let out a soft, uneven breath, the bottle still between her lips. Her tiny fingers curled loosely against the fabric of his worn flannel shirt, unaware that the air around her had just shifted. The woman took a slow step forward, then another, her heels no longer clicking but pressing cautiously against the tile like she was afraid the sound might break something fragile in front of her. And for a brief second, the power she carried when she walked into boardrooms or signed contracts worth millions seemed to vanish, replaced by something far more human, something uncertain. "I've been looking everywhere," she said, her voice steadier now but still tight at the edges, her eyes never leaving the baby, then flicking briefly to Daniel, scanning him, measuring him, trying to understand the quiet scene she had just interrupted. Daniel nodded once, gently easing the bottle away as the baby began to settle, her cries reduced to soft whimpers. She was left near the back booth. He said simply, no accusation, no judgment, just fact, the kind that didn't demand explanation but made space for it. Lily shifted in her seat, watching the woman with wide, curious eyes, then looked back at her father. She was really hungry, she added softly, as if offering context that mattered more than anything else. The woman blinked, something in her expression tightening, then loosening again, like a thought she hadn't expected to feel. I was only gone for a minute, she said, almost to herself, her hand instinctively moving to her chest, fingers brushing the edge of a tailored coat that spoke of a life far removed from this place. I had to take a call. A few quiet murmurs rippled through the diner, subtle, restrained, but present, and Daniel heard them. Of course he did, but he didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them. He only shifted the baby slightly, supporting her head with practiced care before looking back at the woman. She's okay, he said, his tone even, grounded. Just needed someone to notice. That landed differently, not sharp, not accusing, but firm in a way that didn't invite argument. And for the first time since she walked in, the woman's gaze held his a second longer, as if she was trying to read something deeper beneath his calm surface. Thank you, she said finally, the words quieter now, stripped of formality, and when she stepped closer, Daniel didn't hesitate. He carefully guided the baby back into her arms, slow, deliberate, making sure the small blanket stayed wrapped around her, his hands steady until he was certain she had her. The baby stirred, letting out a soft sigh as she settled against her mother's shoulder, and the woman exhaled, a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, her posture softening just slightly as she held her child close. For a moment, no one spoke. The diner suspended in that quiet space between tension and understanding, and Lily leaned forward just a little, studying the woman with innocent curiosity before whispering. She looks like she feels better now. The woman glanced down at her baby, then back at Lily, and something flickered in her eyes, something warmer, unfamiliar, like a door opening, just a crack. But then she looked at Daniel again, really looked this time, at the worn sleeves, the tired eyes, the quiet way he stood without needing recognition, and her voice lowered, almost cautious. You didn't have to do that, most people wouldn't. Daniel shrugged slightly, not dismissive, just honest, his gaze softening as he glanced at Lily before answering. Most people are busy, he said, then after a small pause, we weren't. And something about that simple truth settled into the room heavier than anything loud ever could, because it wasn't just what he did, it was how easily he had chosen to do it, without knowing who she was, without expecting anything in return, and for the first time in a long while, the woman who owned more than most people could imagine stood there holding her child, realizing she had just been seen, not for her status, not for her power, but for a moment she almost missed, and the weight of that realization didn't make noise, it simply stayed, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. You really stayed with her the whole time, didn't you? The woman asked quietly, her voice no longer carrying authority, but something softer, something almost unfamiliar, and Daniel didn't answer right away. He just reached for a napkin and wiped a small drop of milk from the baby's chin with the same care he had shown from the beginning, then stepped back slightly. Giving her space without stepping away completely, the diner slowly began to breathe again, forks moving, low conversations returning, but not quite the same as before, because something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. She was crying, Daniel said at last, his tone simple, like the answer explained everything that needed to be explained, and in a way, it did. The woman adjusted the baby against her shoulder, her hand instinctively supporting the small back as she swayed gently, a motion that came from instinct more than practice, and for a second, her eyes drifted toward the window, toward the fading light outside, as if she was replaying the last few minutes in her mind, searching for where she had lost control of a moment that suddenly felt much bigger than it should have been. Her name is Ava, she added, almost as if the name itself grounded her, and Lily smiled softly from the booth. She's really brave, Lily said, her voice light but sincere. She stopped crying really fast. The woman looked at her, surprised, then gave a small nod, her lips curving just slightly, the kind of smile that didn't belong to press photos or corporate events, but to something quieter, something real. "Thank you," she said again, this time to both of them, and Daniel gave a small nod in return, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just present in that steady way that didn't demand attention but never disappeared either. A man at the counter cleared his throat, muttering something about people needing to be more careful, and the words hung in the air just long enough to be noticed. But Daniel didn't turn, didn't react, and neither did the woman, at least not outwardly, though her grip on Ava tightened just a fraction before easing again. "I should have asked someone to watch her," she admitted, her voice lower now, almost reflective. I thought I'd be quick." Daniel glanced at Lily, then back at her, his expression unchanged but his eyes softer. "Sometimes quick turns into something else," he said, not correcting her, not judging, just stating a truth that sounded like it came from experience rather than opinion. And for a moment, the woman's gaze lingered on him again, studying him not like a stranger, but like a question she didn't know how to ask yet. "You have a daughter," she said, her eyes flicking briefly to Lily, who sat up a little straighter under the attention. "Yes, ma'am," Lily answered before Daniel could speak, a hint of pride in her voice. "He takes really good care of me." That drew a faint exhale from the woman, something between a breath and a quiet laugh, and she nodded slowly, as if confirming something she hadn't expected to see today. "I can tell," she said, her voice warm now, and for the first time since she walked in, the tension in her shoulders seemed to loosen, just slightly, like she had stepped out of a role she carried everywhere else. Daniel reached for his jacket draped over the back of the booth, slipping it on with an easy motion, the kind that signaled departure without urgency, and Lily followed his lead, sliding out of her seat and grabbing her small backpack. "We should get going," Daniel said, his tone respectful but final, not lingering, not waiting for anything in return, and that, more than anything, made the woman pause. "Wait," she said, the word coming out before she could stop it, and both Daniel and Lily turned back, not surprised, just attentive. She hesitated for half a second, her eyes moving between them, then back to Daniel, something unspoken settling behind her gaze, something that didn't belong to business or obligation. "At least let me thank you properly," she said, her voice steadier now, but carrying a quiet weight, as if this moment mattered more than she had planned for, and Daniel held her gaze for a brief second before answering, his voice calm, unchanged. "You already did," he said, then after a small pause, "She's okay." And that was it, no expectation, no request, just a quiet closing of the moment. But the way the woman looked at him after that, the way her eyes stayed just a second longer than necessary, suggested that for her, this wasn't over, not even close. The diner door closed behind them with a soft chime that seemed louder than before, not because of the sound itself, but because of what had been left unsaid inside, and Daniel didn't look back, not out of indifference, but because he had learned long ago that some moments didn't need to be held onto to matter. Outside, the evening air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt as he guided Lily toward his old pickup truck parked under a flickering streetlight. "Daddy, was that her real mommy?" Lily asked as she climbed into the passenger seat, her voice gentle, thoughtful in that way children sometimes are when they sense something bigger than themselves but don't yet have the words for it. Daniel paused for just a second before closing his door, the engine turning over with a low rumble as he settled into his seat. "Yes," he said simply, glancing at her with a small nod. "She was." Lily looked down at her hands, then back out the window as the truck rolled slowly onto the quiet road, headlights stretching across the darkening pavement. "She looked scared," Lily added, almost whispering it, like she wasn't sure if it was okay to say. Daniel exhaled softly, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting loosely near the gear shift. "Sometimes people are," he replied, his voice calm, even when they don't expect to be. The drive home was quiet, not heavy, just still, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, and when they pulled into the gravel driveway of their small house just outside town, the porch light cast a warm glow against the worn wooden steps, a quiet welcome that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with consistency. Inside, The house carried the familiar scent of laundry soap and old pine wood, the faint creak of the floorboards greeting them as Lily kicked off her shoes and padded toward the kitchen. "Can I have cocoa?" she asked, already reaching for the chipped mug she always used, the one with the faded cartoon bear on the side. Daniel smiled faintly, hanging his jacket by the door before moving to the stove. "You can," he said, filling a small pot with milk, the simple routine grounding the night back into something ordinary. A few minutes later, they sat at the small kitchen table, steam rising gently from their cups, the soft ticking of the wall clock filling the quiet space between them. Lily took a sip, then looked up at him, her eyes serious now, searching. "Daddy, why do you help people even when they're not careful?" she asked, the question landing softly but carrying more weight than her small voice suggested. Daniel didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know, but because he respected the question enough to let it breathe, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting for a moment to the window where the night pressed gently against the glass. "Because being careful isn't the same as being alone," he said finally, his tone steady, thoughtful. "And sometimes people don't need someone perfect, they just need someone who stays." Lily frowned just a little, thinking about that, then nodded slowly, as if something inside her clicked into place. "Like you stayed with the baby," she said, more statement than question. Daniel gave a small nod, a quiet confirmation. "Like that," he replied. She wrapped both hands around her mug, holding it close as the warmth settled in, her shoulders relaxing as she leaned back in her chair. "Do you think someone would stay like that for me?" she asked after a moment, her voice softer now, vulnerable in a way that only showed itself in the quietest parts of the day. Daniel's expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes did, something deeper, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table so he was level with her. "Someone already does," he said, his voice calm, certain, leaving no room for doubt. Lily's lips curved into a small, sleepy smile, and she nodded again, this time without hesitation, as if that answer was all she needed. The clock ticked on, the house settling around them, and for a moment, the world outside felt far away, reduced to nothing more than distant headlights and passing wind, while inside, in that quiet kitchen, something steady and unspoken took root, not loud, not dramatic, just the kind of quiet strength that didn't announce itself, but never left once it was there, and somewhere across town, a woman who had everything sat holding her child, unable to forget the man who had stayed without being asked, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself wondering what that kind of presence might feel like if it didn't disappear. The next morning came quietly, the kind of quiet that didn't announce itself but settled gently into the walls, and Daniel was already awake before the sun fully broke over the tree line, standing at the kitchen sink with a chipped mug of black coffee, watching the early light stretch across the yard like it was testing whether the world was ready for another day. He didn't rush mornings, not anymore, because rushing had never made anything easier, it had only made things louder. "Daddy, is it school day?" Lily's voice came soft from the hallway, still thick with sleep, and Daniel turned slightly, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "It is," he said, setting the mug down as she padded into the kitchen, her hair slightly tangled, her oversized sweater slipping off one shoulder like it always did. "5 more minutes?" she asked, already knowing the answer, but hoping anyway. Daniel crouched slightly to her level, his voice gentle but steady. "You said that yesterday," he replied, not correcting, just reminding. Lily sighed, then nodded, accepting it with a small, practiced resilience that children learn when life doesn't bend easily. By the time they stepped outside, the air carried that crisp morning chill, and Daniel brushed a stray leaf off the hood of his truck before opening the passenger door for her, the same small gesture he never skipped, not because it mattered to anyone else, but because it mattered to him. "Daddy," Lily said again as they drove, her eyes tracing the passing trees. "Do you think that lady found her baby's favorite blanket?" Daniel glanced at her briefly, then back at the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "I think she's trying to," he said, his voice calm, thoughtful. Lily nodded slowly, then after a pause, she didn't look like she knew what to do. Daniel exhaled quietly, the memory of the diner still sitting somewhere behind his eyes, not heavy, just present. "Sometimes people know a lot of things," he said, choosing his words with care. but they still forget the small ones when it matters most. Lily frowned a little at that, turning it over in her mind like she always did, then leaned her head lightly against the window. The school drop-off lane was already filling up when they arrived. Parents in pressed clothes, kids with matching backpacks, a world that moved faster than Daniel ever tried to match. And he pulled up slowly, shifting the truck into park. "You gonna be okay today?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes attentive. Lily smiled, small but certain. "Yeah," she said, then hesitated before adding, "Are you?" Daniel paused for just a second, surprised not by the question, but by how naturally she asked it, and he nodded once. "I will be," he said, simple, honest. She studied him for a brief moment longer, then leaned over and hugged him quickly before hopping out, her small figure disappearing into the flow of students. Daniel watched until she reached the doors, until she turned once and waved, and only then did he shift the truck back into drive, the engine humming low as he pulled away. Back at the garage, the familiar scent of oil and metal greeted him like an old habit, and he slipped into the rhythm of work without thinking, tightening bolts, checking engines, the kind of tasks that didn't ask questions, just required attention. "You look like you didn't sleep," Jackson's voice cut in from across the bay, tossing a rag onto the workbench. Daniel shrugged slightly, not defensive, just matter of fact. "Slept enough," he replied, reaching for a wrench. Jackson smirked, leaning against the counter. "Heard there was some drama at the diner last night," he added, tone light but curious. "Something about a fancy woman losing her kid for a minute." Daniel didn't react the way most would, didn't lean in, didn't elaborate. He just kept working, his movements steady. "Kid's fine," he said, and that was all. No judgment, no story, just the outcome that mattered. Jackson studied him for a second, then shook his head with a half-laugh. "Man, you always make things sound smaller than they are." Daniel tightened the last bolt and wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze calm. "Or maybe they're just not as big as people think," he replied, and the words settled into the space between them with a quiet weight that didn't need to be explained. And somewhere across town, in a glass-walled office high above the noise of the city, a woman sat staring at her phone, replaying a moment she couldn't seem to move past, because for all the decisions she made every day, none of them had ever felt as unexpectedly important as the one she hadn't made, and the man who had made it for her without asking. "You left before I could even ask your name," the woman said softly to herself, her voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the city below, as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her office, Ava resting gently against her shoulder, the baby now calm, fed, and sleeping, unaware that her absence the night before had created a moment her mother could not stop replaying. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Steel and light and power, everything she had built, everything she controlled, and yet none of it had prepared her for the way one quiet man in a roadside diner had looked at her without knowing who she was. "Ms. Vance, your 10 a.m. is waiting." Her assistant's voice came through the intercom, polished, efficient, the kind of voice that kept her world moving on schedule, and Madison Vance closed her eyes for just a second before turning away from the window. "Reschedule it," she said, her tone calm but firm, not rushed, not explained. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Of course, is everything all right?" Madison looked down at Ava, brushing a small strand of hair from the baby's forehead, her expression softening in a way no boardroom had ever seen. "No," she said quietly, almost to herself, "not yet." Across town, Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, the metallic clink of tools echoing through the garage as the late morning sun filtered through the open bay doors, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. And for a moment, he paused, not because of the work, but because something felt slightly out of place, not wrong, just different, like the air before a shift you couldn't quite name. "You ever think about doing something else?" Jackson asked suddenly, leaning against the workbench again, his tone casual, but his eyes sharper than usual. Daniel didn't look up right away, tightening one last bolt before answering. "Every now and then," he said, his voice steady, "but thinking doesn't change much." Jackson chuckled lightly. "Yeah, but sometimes it points you somewhere," he replied. Then after a beat, "Like last night, most guys would have just called it in and walked away." Daniel set the wrench down, finally glancing at him, not defensive, just clear. Most guys weren't there, he said, and that ended it, not with tension, but with a quiet understanding that didn't need more words. Back in the city, Madison moved through her office slower than usual, not because she didn't have somewhere to be, but because for the first time in years, she wasn't sure where that place was, and she sat down at her desk, pulling up the security report from the night before, her fingers hesitating for just a moment before pressing play. The grainy footage showed the diner, the angles slightly off, the lighting imperfect, but it was enough to see him, to see Daniel sitting there, holding Ava with that same quiet steadiness, feeding her without urgency, without hesitation, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Madison leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in focus, studying every movement, every small detail, as if she might understand something she had missed in the moment. "You didn't even look around," she murmured, watching the screen. "You just stayed." The video ended, the screen going still, but the feeling didn't, and she leaned back slowly, her hand resting lightly against Ava's back as the baby shifted in her arms. "Find him," she said after a long pause, her voice quiet but resolute, not driven by control, but by something deeper, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I want to know who he is." And miles away, unaware of the ripple he had set in motion, Daniel stepped outside the garage for a brief breath of air, the wind brushing against his face as he looked out at the road, calm as ever, grounded as always, not knowing that somewhere, someone who had everything was now searching for the one thing she couldn't. By the quiet presence of a man who had stayed when no one asked him to. "My dad always helps people, even when they don't ask." Lily's voice carried softly across the small classroom, not loud, not trying to impress anyone, just simple and certain, the kind of truth that didn't need decoration. And her teacher paused for just a second, marker hovering midair as a few of the other children turned to look at her, curious, not because of the words themselves, but because of the quiet confidence behind them. Lily didn't notice the shift, she just kept coloring the edge of her paper, a drawing of a small house, a truck, and two stick figures standing close together. "That's a good thing," the teacher said gently, her voice warm. "Why do you think he does that?" Lily shrugged a little, not overthinking it, her small shoulders rising and falling like it was the easiest question in the world. "Because people need someone," she said, then after a small pause, "and he stays." The classroom settled into a soft silence for a moment, not heavy, just thoughtful, before the lesson continued, but the words lingered in the air longer than anything written on the board. Hours later, Daniel's truck rolled slowly into the school pickup line, the engine humming low as he waited, hands resting loosely on the wheel, his posture calm, like always. And when Lily spotted him through the window, she smiled, that same small, steady smile, and ran toward the truck with her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. "Hey, kiddo," Daniel said as she climbed in, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face without thinking, a habit as natural as breathing. "Hey, Daddy," she replied, buckling her seatbelt before turning toward him, her eyes bright with something she had been holding on to all day. "I told my teacher about you," she said, not proud in a loud way, just open, like sharing something important. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, glancing at her as he pulled the truck forward. "Oh yeah?" he asked, his tone light but attentive. Lily nodded quickly. "I told her you help people, even when they forget stuff," she added, her words tumbling out with quiet certainty. Daniel didn't respond right away, not because he disagreed, but because he understood the weight behind simple words, and he let the truck ease onto the road before speaking. "That sounds like something you'd say," he replied gently, a faint smile touching his lips. Lily leaned back in her seat, satisfied. Then after a moment, she looked out the window, watching the trees blur past. "Do you think that lady is okay now?" she asked, her voice softer, returning to the thread that hadn't left her since the night before. Daniel's hand stayed steady on the wheel, his gaze forward, but his tone softened just slightly. "I think she's trying to be," he said, honest, not guessing, not assuming, just offering what he knew. Lily nodded slowly, absorbing that, then turned back to him. "If she forgets again, someone will help her, right?" she asked, the question simple but layered with the kind of trust only a child could hold so naturally. Daniel exhaled quietly, a small breath that carried more thought than it showed. "I think someone will," he said. Then after a brief pause, because that's how it works. People help each other, even when they don't know each other. Lily smiled at that, her shoulders relaxing as she leaned her head lightly against the seat. Like you, she said, almost as a reminder more than a compliment. Daniel didn't correct her, didn't expand on it. He just nodded once, accepting the truth in the way she saw the world, not as something extraordinary, but as something steady, repeatable, a way of living rather than a single moment. The truck rolled on, the late afternoon light stretching across the road, quiet and warm, and somewhere behind them, in a different part of the same town, a black SUV slowed near the edge of the auto shop parking lot, tinted windows reflecting the fading sun, and inside, Madison Vance watched through the glass, her eyes fixed on the man she had finally found, the one who had no idea she was there, the one whose life was already proving something she had only just begun to understand, and as Lily's soft voice echoed in memory, he stays. Madison felt something shift again, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable, because for the first time, she wasn't looking for power, she was looking for proof, and she had just found it standing in plain sight. That him? The driver asked quietly from the front seat, eyes flicking toward the garage as the engine idled low, and Madison didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed through the tinted glass, steady, focused, as she watched Daniel step back inside, wiping his hands on a rag like it was just another ordinary afternoon, like nothing about him required attention, and somehow, that was exactly what held hers. The garage doors stood open to the cooling air, the scent of oil and metal drifting outward, and inside, the rhythm of work continued, tools clinking, voices low, the kind of place where no one expected anything extraordinary to happen, and yet Madison remained still, her fingers resting lightly against Ava's blanket as the baby stirred in her car seat beside her. Yes, she said finally, her voice quiet, certain, not rushed. That's him. The driver nodded once, then glanced ahead again, respectful enough not to ask more, and Madison leaned back slightly, her eyes never fully leaving the scene, as if she was trying to understand something that couldn't be measured in numbers or control. Across the lot, Daniel stepped out again, this time carrying a small toolbox, setting it down near the edge of the pavement as an older man approached with a worn sedan, the hood slightly misaligned, the kind of car that told its story without words. I can't pay much, the man said, his voice rough, almost apologetic, and Daniel shook his head once, not dismissive, just steady. Let's see what it needs first, he replied, kneeling down without hesitation, his movements efficient, practiced, but never rushed, and Madison watched closely, not the work itself, but the way he listened, the way he didn't make the man feel smaller for asking. And something about that landed deeper than anything she had seen on a screen. Ava shifted again, letting out a soft sound, and Madison instinctively reached back, adjusting the blanket, her hand lingering there for a moment longer than necessary. You always do this, she murmured softly, more to the memory than to the child. You just stay. The words echoed against Lily's voice from earlier, not heard directly, but felt, as if the meaning had traveled farther than distance allowed. A few minutes passed, quiet, uninterrupted, until a small figure appeared at the edge of the lot, a girl with a backpack slightly too big for her shoulders, walking carefully along the gravel path, and Madison leaned forward just slightly, her attention sharpening. Lily approached the garage without hesitation, weaving past the parked cars until she reached Daniel, tugging gently at his sleeve. Daddy, she said, her voice soft but clear, and Daniel looked up immediately, his expression shifting in that subtle way Madison hadn't noticed before, something warmer, something grounded. Hey, kiddo, he replied, setting the wrench aside without a second thought. You're early. Lily nodded, glancing briefly at the older man before looking back at her father. School let out early, she said, then after a small pause. I can help if you want. Daniel smiled faintly, shaking his head. You already do, he said, and Lily seemed to accept that without question, stepping back just enough to watch, her presence quiet but constant, like she belonged there, like this was normal. The older man looked between them, a hint of surprise softening into something like understanding, and Madison felt it too, not as a realization, but as a confirmation, something she hadn't been able to name until now. He doesn't just help people, she whispered under her breath, her eyes still fixed on the scene. He lives that way. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but said nothing, sensing the weight in her tone, and Madison sat there a moment longer, watching as Daniel tightened the last bolt, stood up, and handed the man a simple nod. No transaction, no exchange beyond quiet respect. And when Lily smiled up at him, small and certain, it wasn't admiration, it was recognition. And in that stillness, something settled inside Madison, not loud, not sudden, just clear, because for all the power she held, for all the decisions she controlled, none of it had ever shown her this kind of consistency, this quiet dignity that didn't need to be announced. And as the engine of the SUV remained idle, she realized she wasn't here to observe anymore. She was here to step into a story that had already begun without her. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't reach for control, she reached for the door. "Daddy!" Lily's voice rang out across the lot, bright and unfiltered, cutting through the low hum of the garage like something pure and undeniable. And before Daniel could even turn fully, she was already running, her small shoes kicking up bits of gravel as she closed the distance between them without hesitation, without doubt, like she had done 100 times before. And Daniel dropped the rag in his hand without thinking, instinct taking over as he opened his arms just in time for her to collide gently into him, wrapping herself around his waist with a quiet certainty that needed no permission. "Hey, easy," he murmured softly, one hand coming to rest on the back of her head, the other holding her close, not tight, not possessive, just steady, like he always was. And for a moment, the world around them seemed to slow, the sounds of tools, engines, distant traffic fading into something softer, something background, because this was the part of his life that didn't rush, didn't change, didn't need anything more than what it already had. "I thought you were still working," Lily said into his shirt, her voice muffled but warm, and Daniel let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh. "I was," he said, then after a pause, "but I always come back." Lily pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes searching his face like she always did when she needed to hear something without him saying it twice. "Even if it gets really late?" she asked softly, not anxious, just wanting the truth the way children do. Daniel didn't hesitate, didn't soften it with anything unnecessary. He just nodded once, his voice calm, grounded. "Even then," he said, and something in the way he said it didn't just answer her question, it settled it completely. Nearby, Madison stood a few steps from the SUV now, the door still open behind her, Ava cradled against her shoulder, and she hadn't moved. Closer. Not yet, because something about the moment in front of her didn't invite interruption. It asked for witness, and she stood there quietly, watching not a man proving anything, not a moment built for attention, but a life lived in small, consistent choices that added up to something she had never learned how to measure. Daniel brushed a loose strand of Lily's hair back behind her ear, his hand lingering there for just a second before dropping back to his side, and Lily smiled, that same small, certain smile, like everything she needed was already there. "Can we go home now?" she asked, simple, natural, as if nothing extraordinary had happened today at all. Daniel glanced toward the garage, then back at her, and nodded. "Yeah," he said, picking up his jacket from the workbench. "We can go home." He didn't look toward Madison, didn't notice her standing there, because his focus had never been on who was watching, only on who was waiting. And as he took Lily's hand and began to walk toward the truck, something about the scene settled into a quiet stillness that no words could quite reach. Madison exhaled slowly, her grip on Ava softening as she watched them leave, not with regret, not with urgency, but with something deeper, something that didn't rush to change what was already whole, because for the first time, she understood that what she had seen wasn't something to take, it was something to learn from, something to respect, something that existed without needing recognition. The truck door opened, then closed. The engine turned over with a familiar hum, and as Daniel pulled away, Lily's voice carried faintly through the open window. "Bye, Daddy's work," followed by a small laugh that faded into the distance, leaving behind a space that felt quieter, but somehow fuller. And in that silence, the kind that doesn't echo but stays, the story found its truth not in wealth, not in status, not in who owned what, but in who stayed, in who returned, in who chose, every single day, to be there without needing to be seen. So tell me, in a world that moves fast and forgets easily, who would you stay for? And who would stay for you? And if you believe in quiet, dignity, in second chances, and in the kind of love that doesn't make noise but never leaves, take a moment to subscribe and be part of stories that remind us what truly matters.